Hi, all. I'm going to give it about a minute until we get started. So thank you for your patience. Okay, thank you everybody for joining. Happy to see a lot of folks on. Welcome to the second webinar in our Erase Summer webinar series. You are on the State Legislative Efforts to Advance Tenant Protections webinar. Just a few things before we get started. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box, and we are going to save Q&A for the end of the webinar. And I am Tori Beret, so I'm actually taking over for Netta today, who is unable to join us. So for the agenda, we are going to just hear from me. I'm going to give an update on our resources related to tenant protections. And then we're going to hear from Kayla Laywell on our policy team, who's going to give an overview of federal tenant protection advocacy we've been doing. And then you'll hear from our lovely partners all over the country on their successful tenant protection campaigns. So first off, we'll have Angelica Moran from the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy talking about enacting laws limiting excessive application and treasury tenancy fees. And then we'll have Katie West from the Housing Network of Rhode Island discuss passing laws banning application fees. Third, we'll have Andrew Bradley from Prosperity, Indiana discuss enacting eviction ceiling laws. And lastly, we'll have Tanya Myers-Phillips from Michigan Legal Services and Detroit Right to Counsel Coalition discuss their efforts to implement a tenant's right to counsel program. And then I'll wrap it up with the Q&A. Next slide, please. So before passing it over to our guests, I just wanted to highlight a few of the resources that we've created. So our first is our local tenant protections database. It was originally created in 2021 to highlight short-term tenant protections. And since then, we've updated it to include protections after 2021 and then before 2021. So we highlight 5 main categories, including right to counsel protections, source of income protections, rent stabilization, just cause eviction standards, and eviction record sealing and expungement. But we also track other protections, including anti-retaliation laws, code enforcement, and habitability standards. On our tenant protection site, Netta will be posting a link. You're able to search for tenant protections that have been passed. So we filter by, you can filter by year, category, and by state, or by city and county. And then we list whether the protection is active, expired, or has been repealed. And we also track preemptions, which will be useful to some folks. And then there's also a bunch of briefs that we put out recently. This includes a brief on eviction record sealing, an expungement, a brief on just cause eviction standards, and we did a brief highlighting the ways in which states have passed tenant protections since the pandemic. And we'll post those resources in the chat. So next slide, please. And below is the link to our main tenant protection site where you can dig deeper into our publications and learn more about the tenant protections work we've been doing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kayla Laywell, who's going to discuss our work on federal tenant protections. Kayla, over to you.
Thanks so much, Tori. Hi, everybody. My name is Kayla Laywell. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a housing policy analyst here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So as part of NLIHC's tenant protections work, I'm going to be speaking about the FHFA request for input that is open now until Monday. So as folks know, and I will just put the first of a few links in the chat, FHFA, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which typically works in the secondary mortgage market, released on May 30th a request for input, so an open call for information on how FHFA can create and enforce renter protections for the 12 million renters that live in their multifamily properties. Those are properties with federally backed mortgages by FHFA. So over the last 2 months now, NLIHC has, we've hosted working groups, we have an organizational sign-on letter, and finally we're calling for individuals and organizations to submit their own comments in support of strong renter protections. Now, what does that mean? NLIHC is fighting for 4 top opportunities. NLIHC's top 4 opportunities for federal renter protections include source of income protections, just cause eviction standards, anti-rent gouging protections, and finally, requirements to ensure that housing is safe, decent, accessible, and healthy, or healthy housing standards. So finally, in the last 5 days, we have until the end of day Monday, July 31st, we are urging people to make their final push, their final call to advance federal renter protections. You know, even if the Federal Housing Finance Agency makes any kind of action towards federal tenant protections, this would impact 12 million renters, and it would put the country on a strong pathway towards renter protections for all renters, even those not in FHFA-backed properties. So a couple actions I ask of you all today. First, we have an organizational sign-on letter that calls out specifically those 4 priorities I just listed. I will put that in the chat, and that will be open until Monday when we are going to close it and send the letter to FHFA. Second, I am calling on everyone, organizations and individuals, to submit your own comment to FHFA. As of this morning, there were 2,560 comments. And a lot of those are tenants just sharing their individual stories about why, you know, source of income protections or just cause eviction standards have helped me or would have helped me in my jurisdiction, and why those protections really matter. So I'll put a link to our comment letter and tenantcomment.org, which People's Action and the Homes Guarantee Campaign have been, tenants have been activating widely on that. And I think that is all. I can hold for a few questions as I put some more links in the chat. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks, Kayla. We're going to do questions at the end, so if you can stay on, that would be fantastic. So with that, that was a wonderful overview of our work, Kayla. Thank you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Angelica Moran from the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy, who's going to be talking about their work to pass laws limiting excessive application and tenancy fees. So with that, Angelica, happy to have you on and presenting today.
Thank you so much, Tori. So as Tori mentioned, my name is Angelica, and I'm a policy specialist at the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy and the Idaho Asset Building Network. And if we can please go to the next slide. So just a little overview. So the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization committed to offering Idahoans high quality research and analysis to help our state make informed policy decisions and contribute to Idaho when it comes to some policy change. And the Idaho Asset Building Network is a project of the center. And the Idaho Asset Building Network aims to connect leaders, service providers, businesses, and consumers statewide to advance policies that support all Idahoans in achieving long-term financial security. And a big goal in that is ensuring that all Idahoans have access to a safe and affordable home. So then if we can go to the next slide, please. So we have been working on the Erase project for a few years, and some of our goals around the Erase project in our organization is to ensure Idahoans have equitable and continued access to ERA funds, which are those emergency rental assistance funds, to enhance renter protections in Idaho, which will be my main focus during this presentation, and to also stand up a permanent state-funded rental assistance program in our state. But like I said, for today, I'm just going to focus on that renter protections piece. It is not, it's pretty hard to get a win in our state. So just getting a piece of legislation passed in our state that helps renters has been just a major win, especially since our legislature is made up a lot of landlords. So it's always been a difficult ride. So just always excited to share any positive news that we get from our state. So that'll be my focus today. And if we go to the next slide, I can walk us through how we succeeded this year. So our first step was to create some equity groups to help move our mission and our goals for the legislative session. So we have a housing multi-sector coalition that's made up of over 60 organizations in our state. And that really they really focus on some of the more federal policy pieces, even though they do engage at the state level. So from that group, we decided to kind of make two more working groups that had more of a focus on certain areas when it came to our policy priorities. So we started to convene an ERA equity group, and that group was really focusing on ensuring that the ERA funds were getting passed through Idaho. And a lot of the organizations who were part of that group were actually helping administer those funds or helping Idahoans submit those applications. So they were really a big help in advocating that the program be accessible to as many Idahoans as possible and getting that program just as successful as it can be. And then besides that, since we saw the success of that equity group, we decided to convene a fairness and renting working group. And this working group, the membership also came from that larger multi-sector coalition group. But this working group was really just focusing on, like it says in the working group, fairness and renting. So really enhancing renter protections in our state. So we met with this group. You'll see some of the organizations who are a part of that group here on the screen. And we started to just meet with them and brainstorm different legislations that they might be interested or might be of interest to their organization when it came to renter protections, and kind of go from there of having the discussion of what we think would be realistic to pass during the legislative session. So that was kind of the goal of this equity group, and really helping us fight the battle. As we started to discuss policies that we might bring forward, one of our partners from Jesse Tree, who is a local eviction prevention program, was already working on some legislation. So their director is also a state senator in our state. So she had already introduced some legislation 2 years ago, but it never got the support it needed to get passed. And this year she decided to reintroduce it. So we decided to put all of our efforts behind getting that legislation passed. And if we go to the next slide, I can walk us through what that bill looked like. So the bill was Senate Bill 1039, and the bill now require, since it passed successfully, it required landlords to disclose all fees and rental agreements. And the second piece of that bill is that all rental fees be reasonable. And that language is actually pretty common in our state, the word reasonable, and it's actually used in some homeowner loans and even storage, like renting storage units. And that contract, it says that those fees need to be reasonable. So that language was added because a lot of lawmakers didn't want an exact number in there. And when talking to courts and folks who are in the area of, when it comes to that policy language, they said that reasonable is a word that's used common, and that courts kind of know how to navigate when it comes to them. So that's the language that was then used, that all rental fees be reasonable. And then for landlords to give 30 days notice for any change in fees. So that's what the legislation does. And as you see, it was signed into law, so we were successful, but it definitely took a bit to get there. So I'll walk us through that a little bit. So when this legislation came about, we knew that it would pass the Senate. We had all the votes when it came to that. Senator Robbie really gathered support from lawmakers from both the Republicans and Democrats, and even had a lot of bipartisan co-sponsors on the bill that were senators. So we knew we would make it through the Senate. We were definitely not sure if it would pass the House, especially because our bill went to a committee that is not always favorable for renter protections and so forth, since a lot of those committee members are landlords themselves, and believe that that we shouldn't be getting into that private sector and that form of contract. So we weren't sure we would make it, but after doing a lot of outreach to those committee members, we had the votes to get it passed by one vote. So we knew we would get it passed by that one vote, so we were excited. But then the committee came along and we were getting ready to present the bill to the committee and testify and get it all going. And during that committee, 2 of our yes votes had to leave the committee room to go to other committees that they help run. So when we saw them leave, our 2 votes that we needed to get this passed, we were kind of like, what's happening? But we had to keep going. So we continued to testify and just hope for the best. And like I said, we were pretty at a pretty rocky stage in that point, trying not to panic, but we continued to testify. And it turned out that one testimony changed the whole game for us. So a program director from a local eviction prevention program came and did his testimony. And one of the committee members asked him to give an example of an unreasonable fee that he has seen. And the story that he told was about a little boy who went outside and found a praying mantis. And as one does when you find a praying mantis, you put him in a jar and take him home. So that's what he did. He found a praying mantis, put it in a jar, and took it back home. And when the landlord found out, they ended up charging that family a very unreasonable pet fee for this child bringing in the praying mantis. So I think the family was charged for around $200 to $300 for this little kid bringing in a praying mantis into the home. So I think we can all agree that is a pretty unreasonable fee for what happened. And during that committee, a lot of the lawmakers that we knew were a no vote ended up saying like, okay, that is a ridiculous fee for what happened. And everyone just started raising their hands saying that is very unreasonable. Like, I am pro praying mantis. Like, I am a biology major, like that is not fair. So we ended up passing the bill during that committee with our 2 yes votes leaving and us like certain we weren't going to get that passed. But this story about the praying mantis just really changed the game for us and switched the tone for this legislation. So it ended up passing the House committee, made it onto the House floor and passed as well, and then made it to the governor's office and it was signed into law and we celebrated. And now a praying mantis is our little organization's little mascot, if we would say, and we were just super excited. So that is kind of how that went along. And through all that process, our coalition members who were a part of that working group came and testified and helped us kind of talk to lawmakers about the impact that legislation would have on their sector that they represent, whether it's housing, folks who are over 65, fair housing, and so forth. And then we also had some email action tools that we created through our website that our working group helped us spread the word of. So we had, I think, around like 600 emails sent to a committee at once to get this legislation passed. So it's just really awesome to see everybody come together and for it to be successful. So that's a little bit about our win in Idaho. And again, just super excited that it happened. And if we go to the next slide. So yeah, that is our huge win and we will continue to push some more renter protections. This is really the biggest one we've seen in a while, so we're just super excited and still on a high. So just encourage you all to stay connected by following us on social media. And if you want to further discuss our policy or what our bill looked like, I'm more than happy to go over that with anyone, and my email is right there on the screen. And Tori, I think that's all I have for you, so I'll turn it back to you.
That was fantastic. Great presentation, Angelica. We have a shout out to you from the chat from Danielle in New York, who said that story made my day. And I will say, when I first heard that story, it also made my day. So I'm happy you could share that with us. And thanks again. So next we're going to have, yeah, of course. Next, we're going to have Katie West from the Housing Network of Rhode Island come on and talk about a variety of different efforts that they were able to get passed this past session. So Katie, take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tori, and thanks to the National Low Income Housing Coalition for hosting these webinar series. And just want to acknowledge Angelica and the work that you're doing in Idaho. Can appreciate we're in a different landscape in Rhode Island, which I'm going to talk about. So the winds are maybe that much more sweeter. So the network is the state's membership association of 15 nonprofit community development corporations or affordable housing developers, and we're the backbone organization for Homes RI, which is what I work on. That's our multi-sector coalition working to increase and preserve the supply of safe, healthy, and affordable homes. And as part of that, expanding part of our work is focusing on removing barriers to safe, healthy, affordable housing, including tenant protections. If we can go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about briefly just to give a snapshot of the political landscape here, and then I'm going to highlight 3 bills that passed our General Assembly this session. So in 2021, after the 2020 elections, we elected a new speaker who made housing his top priority. That definitely helped. He happens to be my representative, so I'm lucky to live in his district. But these are just some of the wins that have been secured for housing under his leadership. And of course, that's acknowledging all the hard work of advocates on the ground, support from the executive administration as well. However, having the speaker prioritize housing definitely shifted the landscape for our advocacy. We can go to the next slide. We have a core slate of legislators coming off of the past 2 election cycles who have really championed housing, and we're working with those folks to cultivate a housing caucus, if you will. And there's 2 of our champions who came to our annual meeting in May, which we were happy to honor. So I'm gonna, if we can go to the next slide, start by talking about the rental application fee bill, which passed this year. And so on the slide, one of the highlights, and this is similar, I think, to what Angelica was talking about. There was a family that was profiled in the Boston Globe in December who, thanks to their courage for being willing to share their experience and their story, they were evicted through no fault of their home because the landlord wanted to rent their house out to a family member. Over the next year and a half, they searched for housing. They had a housing voucher to no avail. They spent over $5,000 in rental application fees between August 2021 and September 2022. And so hearing that story, and with the Rhode Island Coalition to End Homelessness, which took the lead on advocating for this legislation to be introduced, the House Speaker did take it up and included it in a package of 14 bills aimed at housing that he championed. And I want to just shout out the sponsors, that our legislative sponsors, Representative Cruz and Senator Murray. If we can go to the next slide. What the bill does is it prohibits landlords from charging a rental application fee, but we also wanted to ensure that there was more clarity around screening fees for tenants. So if the landlord, in other words, couldn't say, I'm charging you a screening fee, it's not a rental application fee. So the language in the bill allows tenants to provide their own state background check and their own credit report within 90 days. If they don't provide it, then the landlord can charge them only for the cost of what it costs them to obtain a credit check or a background check. and they must provide a copy to the tenant. So the tenant then has a copy. If they're going to other apartments to apply, they can take that with them and provide that as proof. One of the yellow flags that we want to consider as we think about implementation, this goes into effect January 1st, is enforcement isn't defined, and just educating landlords and tenants about this law. Next slide. The next set of bills that were a huge success have to do with lead poisoning prevention, but really they are housing stability and ensuring that our existing housing stock, which Rhode Island has the third oldest housing stock in the country, and 1 in 14 kindergartners has elevated blood lead levels, which is just really gross when you think about it. So the Attorney General, who has taken a really hard line on pursuing landlords who are non-compliant for lead hazard mitigation. In these bills, the one I'm going to talk about is the rental registry bill, but I encourage folks to, when you get the slides, if you want to read through, and if you have any questions, please reach out to me. So next slide. The rental registry, which was a huge success. We have been advocating for a rental registry in Rhode Island for at least 5 years, but it requires all landlords to register with the Department of Health. And then if they have a property that was constructed prior to 1978, they must provide their lead certificate of conformance with lead hazard mitigation, which is already a requirement, but I believe there's an estimate that fewer than 10% of landlords are compliant with this. So it's really a compliance measure and an accountability measure to ensure people are living in safe and healthy housing. Next slide. And then the last, so this is what helped before I skip to the next bill, was definitely the AG's office and his amazing team championing this legislation and using their clout to work with the General Assembly champions. There were strong legislative champions as sponsors, and in partnership with Homes RI, the AG's office, many other advocates, we really worked to make sure that there was visibility around this package of bills, including op-eds, media coverage. We hosted a lead poisoning prevention day, which was held at the State House and got some good media coverage. And there were also a lot of not a lot, but a couple of highly visible lawsuits against non-compliant landlords that I think turn the tide in terms of people understanding the need to support this legislation. Next slide. The last bill I'm going to highlight is eviction ceiling. This is also another piece of legislation that we have been advocating for at least 5 years. And in 2023, we finally passed a version of it. So I'm going to talk about what the pros and cons of this version are, but it's such a testament, I think, to the success and of the coalition and the advocates on the ground who have been willing to talk about their experience with eviction and the damage that it caused or causes. You can go to the next slide. So what this bill does is it is a motion it's a sealing upon request, basically. So once the case is concluded, any party can file a motion to seal the record. Parties are limited to one request every 5 years, which was a major concession that was made in the negotiations to get this bill over the finish line. The court is able to consider several factors in ruling on the motion to seal the record. The major pro is that there's now a path for tenants to have an eviction action sealed from their record and help them restore access to housing opportunities that were likely blocked because they had a filing that was publicly visible. Obviously, the yellow flags that we are going to work to strengthen are that this can only happen every 5 years and it's not an automatic sealing. Next slide. These are just some honorable mentions of other tenant protection bills that passed. So in the House, didn't make it through the Senate, so we're going to be working on it this coming year, was a bill that would increase the amount of time a landlord has to give notice of a rent increase. And what also passed was a bill that allows, Rhode Island has a law that tenants can deduct up to $125 from their rent for repairs. That was increased to $500. That makes a lot of sense given the cost of repairs. And then the Senate president prioritized lead pipe replacement. And so legislation passed to replace lead pipes in residences and to provide tenants notice around that. There was also an exemption from lead laws for 2 to 3 family occupied homes, and that exemption was removed. Next slide. These are successes and challenges. These are going to be, I think, similar to what many of you are likely experiencing if you're working in cross coalition work and with state legislatures. Keeping focused. There were a lot of housing bills this session in Rhode Island. And so sometimes the urgency of the issue means there's different priorities. But we were able to be successful, I think, because of the strength of advocates across the coalition and people who are willing to come out and share their stories. And the last slide is just our contact information, and I'll put my email in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katie. Sorry, I had turned on my video. There we go. Thanks, Katie. That was a great presentation. More kudos in the chat to you for all the work that awesome advocates have accomplished in Rhode Island. And just really appreciate your time. And like I mentioned, there's a lot of questions coming in for you in Q&A and chat, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. So for folks on, hopefully you can keep with us and stay with us so we can get to those questions. So our next presenter is Andrew Bradley with Prosperity Indiana, and he's going to be talking about their legislation that passed that was around enacting the eviction ceiling. So I am going to turn it over to you, Andrew. Thanks for joining us today.
All right, thanks so much, Tori. Thanks to the NLIHC team for having me here. Again, my name is Andrew Bradley. I'm from Prosperity, Indiana. We're the state partner for NLIHC. We also convene the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition, which is our broad set of housing partners. And so what you see here, this is kind of the summary of what I want to talk about today. Unlike Katie, who had such a package of win, and congrats on that, you know, I think the theme of what I would like to say is that here in Indiana, we have a very conservative supermajority in our legislature and a well-documented, publicly reported capture of our legislature on housing issues by some key industry members. So it can be very difficult to make progress and even to be heard. So this story is more about finding lemons, gathering up enough to make some lemonade, and then gathering the seeds for the future. And so what you see here is, you know, these are some of the elements that we use. Let's go on to the next slide and tell some of that story. So above all, I want to point out that we couldn't do anything without the broad, diverse group of partners and coalition members. I'm here representing all of that work and a little bit of the behind the scenes. But we have multi-sector partnerships. We also have tenant-led advocacy that is part of this broader coalition. And definitely want to give them credit for all the results that we've been able to give. And these are some of those partners. Let's keep on moving to the next slide. So first of all, you know, Indiana has had this pre-existing eviction crisis, and there was a key fact that we were able to use data from that crisis to really be able to make the case to make this eviction ceiling law possible. And it all stems back to there was a partner of ours that sat at the Supreme Court's eviction task force. And they created, you can see on the left, that's the order, a new code within small claims courts. Before, if you were trying to get data about evictions, you really had to pour through every single case individually. This created a simple little EV code to say that it's an eviction case. That's what made it possible for our state data to be part of like Eviction Lab's eviction tracking system. If you've looked at that, those are the states that they're able to track. And hopefully if you're from those states, you're well aware of this. So, you know, you can see in Indiana, since the pandemic began, there's now, you know, oh, that number's so small, but like 180 something thousand evictions filed since the beginning of the pandemic. We're able to get that real-time info because of that court filing. So it helps to have people from the legal aid world and attorneys to be able to sit in those bodies wherever possible. So that's what begun. We were able to get that real-time data to be able to tell that story. Let's go to the next slide. So now that we have that, we were able to be able to show how many evictions were being filed. We were also able to use tools like this is Policy Link's Rent Debt Dashboard. We also use the data directly from Census Household Pulse to kind of keep tabs on how, not just the evictions filed, but what's the future look like. And you can see I pulled this today. There's still 77,000 households at risk of eviction in Indiana and 89,000 children in those households. So, again, using that data and using it regularly in our blog posts, in interviews, anytime the media would call, I would talk to them about these issues and make sure to make that part of the public case that we have these really outsized data, outsized eviction filing issues, even compared to other states in the Midwest. Let's go on to the next slide then. So also beyond just quantitative data, qualitative data and stories are so important to getting that story out there and showing why policy is underneath that. So what you see here, these are two examples of the kinds of stories that we get all the time. And these are things that happen way too commonly in Indiana because we're one of only 6 states that doesn't allow tenants living in these kind of conditions to go to court and get be able to put their rent into escrow until the problem is solved, or to repair it themselves and deduct it from rent. And so we help make the case that said that puts a lot of additional pressure on these folks. They end up, they're withholding rent, they're trying to find other places, it reduces the supply, and then it causes a lot of unnecessary additional evictions at no fault to the tenant. And that's where we started to get some head nodding, even from our super conservative majority legislatures. Like, these folks didn't do anything wrong. They're living in places that have these habitable conditions, and creates undue pressure on the system. Let's keep moving to the next slide, please. So these are some of the results from some of those stories and headlines. It started really piling up. The Indiana was really among the top evicting states, and we had 3 cities in the top 20 nationwide, even before the pandemic. And so we were able to, use that, continue that drumbeat, really create more awareness about this as an issue. And even though it was hard to have a proactive agenda item, eviction ceiling was something that we really focused on as something that we wanted to be able to stop the scarlet E. And we worked with some academic partners to show the health effects, economic effects, and employment effects of even just an eviction filing on families. And again, in our political atmosphere, coming back to, we're talking, even these are people who did nothing wrong, that they're still going to carry that scarlet E. Let's move on to the next slide. So I wish that I could tell you that we convinced the legislature and they saw our way and they passed the bill in the right way. Well, it wasn't quite like that, but there was a bill and it did pass. So this started this in 2020, right when the pandemic started. And in 2022, last year, we were able to see this top priority of eviction filing ceiling passed in House Bill 1214. And so these are some of the pros. This is what it does. After 180 days after filing an eviction, the court will direct the plaintiff to dismiss the case if it's not prosecuted. So if it's just sitting there, it helps wipe those cases off. If there's no judgment, or similar to what Katie said before, if there no monetary judgment, if that was satisfied, then those tenants are eligible for that ceiling. And there at the bottom, oh geez, I can't read that. But basically, if the tenant's not at fault, they can go back and apply for that ceiling. So those are the pros. Let's look at the next slide. So there were some cons. Well, one of those things was this wasn't our language. We had a bill that would have made this automatic. It would have been much cleaner and much more straightforward. But a big piece of the reason that this passed was this ended up being included in an industry bill. And the unfortunate thing, the part that that particular industry actor really cared about was making sure that the state's landlord-tenant court-based eviction diversion settlement program would always have to be voluntary. It could never be mandatory. So that's definitely not good. That takes away the teeth and the effectiveness of that program. But it did include this ceiling, so that was definitely, it was a pro. But it did make it voluntary, so that means that there's administrative challenges. Oh yes, this was the stat that was buried on the previous slide, that there's an estimate that up to 40% of households with evictions filed against them hadn't done anything wrong, and basically like it never went to trial. So we estimate that about 74,000 households could be helped by this. All right, so that's the problem though, is you got to reach out to and get 74,000 households to go back to court and to apply through this. So that's a challenge, but let's look at what we've done to try to meet that challenge and move forward on the next slide. So we've worked with some of the law schools that are nearby. We've worked with Indiana Legal Services and the Bar Foundation to provide training to attorneys and to try to spread awareness, to create toolkits, and then continue to use the ERA, the federally funded emergency rental assistance, the housing stability service networks that were created with that, to get that information out, to make it part of the type of case management and legal services that are made available. Let's go on to the next couple of slides, just to show you a couple of examples. These are a few early examples, like kind of the do-it-yourself sheets that were provided to early households that came forward, some of the trainings. And then on the next slide, this is a more recent version. This is now on the Bar Foundation's website. It's a much more streamlined. We're starting to get the word out to folks who this happens to recently, and even folks who this has happened to them before can have that opportunity to wipe that clean. So in terms of like the seeds for the future, we can go ahead to the next slide. We're thinking about how to continue and make this part of our advocacy moving forward, how to build this into more affirmative remedies and try to have some enforcement of those habitability standards. But a positive is that it's provided that opportunity to work with those legal aid partners, to think about the partnership between what's happening at the State House and what can happen at the courthouse and the Supreme Court. So thinking ahead about how to, turn that lemonade and pick up those seeds for next time. So that's what I have. The last slide here is just my email. If anybody has any questions, I'll drop the email into the chat. Always happy to help connect some dots for you. Thanks again to Tori and everybody for having me today.
Thanks, Andrew. Lovely presentation. Lots of questions, which I definitely want to ask a few of those at the end of this session. There's a lot of great questions for you and for the other participants as well around some of this rental registry and eviction ceiling and habitability questions. So thanks all for your engagement as well. Our last presenter is Tanya Myers-Phillips. She will be discussing the work to implement right to counsel for tenants. And so with that, Tanya, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks so much for getting on with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tori, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Again, my name is Tanya Myers-Phillips, and I'm part of the Keeping Detroiters in Their Homes project, and we are a coalition of 5 organizations. Slide, please. I'll go through this pretty fast. Our 5 organizations, we are a lively bunch. We have a combination of attorneys, community activists, and residents. So the United Community Housing Coalition is a legal service provider, an emergency rental assistance provider. They do housing placement, home repair, and tenant organizing. Michigan Legal Services, of which I also serve as public policy advisor, provides legal services and city and statewide public policy advocacy. Congress of Communities provides community organizing, youth and family services, and really provides a bridge with undocumented residents and bilingual services. Detroit Action is a wonderful community organizing agency, does public policy work and provides social services. And Wisdom Institute, also community organizing, public policy, our storytelling guru, and advocates for community-based research. So we're a diverse group. All of our organizations are headquartered in the city of Detroit. All of our project leads live in Detroit, and 3 out of 5 of our project leads are renting their home. A slide. Oh, I'm seeing some things about not hearing me. Let me try and lean in a little bit more. I do apologize for that. It's technology on my end. I'm going to get a little closer here. So I hope that's a bit better. So we are a second-year Erase grantee, and we train Detroit residents, tenants, and homeowners to conduct on-the-ground advocacy, community-based research, focusing on systems change, getting emergency rental assistance out, and developing comprehensive and holistic measures like our right to counsel ordinance. So our big goals for the year, big picture goals, was one, we had a huge victory last year in passing the right to counsel ordinance, becoming the 18th jurisdiction in the nation to do that. So of course, our goal this year is to get full funding and have equitable implementation of that ordinance. 2 is to establish a permanent diversion program with our court that involves community input and leadership. 3 is to really refine our collaborative organizing model to achieve public policy goals. And 4, to use stories to influence policy. Slide, please. So again, just a little bit about us. We're super diverse. Our philosophy as we go where the people are, relational organizing is super important, as well as word of mouth. So we use digital tools, but it's not the end all be all for us. We're really focusing on building those relationships and going deep. We always center the experience of Black and Brown people at the center of our power analysis. We believe power is shared. We infuse art. We collaborate on nearly everything, including grant writing and teamwork. Slide. So this year, of course, in order to have some wins, you have some challenges, right? So one of our challenges was funding and the slow release of funding in Detroit. We're looking at about 25, we're on track for about 25,000 eviction cases in order for everyone to have full legal representation and community outreach. Our demand to our elected body was we need funding of $27 million this year in order to do this in the way we want to do it and we believe the community deserves. So continuing to have those advocacy campaigns and get the money that you need and operate with less than that is certainly a challenge. The release of funds, most of the funding comes through the American Rescue Plan Act, and it's been slow. It's been a slow dribble going through the contract process, the implementation, and again, connecting with those funding has been a slow process. One challenge with the implementation was that United Community Housing Coalition, the grantee for our project here with Erase, was awarded a contract to serve as the right to counsel administrator. And then our city administration decided that they had to rebid again to select service providers, even though they were a service provider as well. So it was super slow to get everybody on board to get going. That was a challenge. Then we had some interesting court policies. We figured we have some money. We have service providers on board. We're figuring things out. And in June, our court moved to 100% in-person proceedings. All of this time, our hearings were remote. So our ordinance passed and right to counsel began implementation in a virtual environment. And that's easier for a lot of reasons. So a sudden shift to mandatory in-person proceedings. You see one of our demonstrators outside with her sign, can't cancel going back to in-person hearings, was a challenge. And simultaneously with that, even though individuals had to come to court in person, if you weren't a litigant, you had to go home. The public access policy changed as well. So that that challenge. And the combination of that resulted in a drop in 30 days of 43% with right to counsel intake. So that was a huge challenge. Next slide. However, we're going to wind up some of those stories and connect those dots in a minute. Wins and opportunities. We are continuing to deepen our business to business network canvassing, looking at non-traditional businesses in our neighborhoods to inform people about their right to counsel. We have a bilingual parent outreach group, bi-weekly renters' rights groups, and we're beginning to move deeper into our youth, young adult, and artist engagement. And we did our first citywide poetry slam evictions in June, which brought in a lot of people who are not traditional advocates or activists, so to speak, but really were attracted to this medium to be able to share their stories and resonate with the struggle. We've been fortunate to have a lot of media coverage. Next slide, please. And we were able to close the gap on our funding needs. So this year in our budget justice campaign, we secured an additional $12 million in city funds and $2.5 million in state funds. So we are now up to $20.5 million over 3 years. So we are excited about that. We're still on the campaign to get everything we believe our community deserves and needs. But boy, tripling the budget sure makes a difference. And being able to make those inroads into the state in a more ingrained way than we've been before, and picking up statewide partnerships and allies has been super important. And I'm running out of time, but we were able to, after 30 days, reverse that public access policy. So the doors to the court are open. In-person proceedings have been modified. Now all of our first hearings are back on Zoom, which makes it so much easier to connect with an attorney quickly and easily. We're now working with the court and publicizing the accommodations policy. They've agreed to do our mailer, a right to counsel information mailer from the court that comes along with your hearing. We have an agreement on signage with the court now. Today, we just shot a public service announcement with community court, our city council president, and we're still working on our diversion program. It's coming. So hopefully next year we have more of a report on that. But that's time, and it's been a wonderful, busy, exciting, crazy year. And thank you so much to the Erase cohort for supporting us.
That was a fantastic overview, Tanya. Thanks for sharing that. And it was great to hear about how you were able to overcome some of those court challenges that popped up in the implementation process. And a lot of kudos coming to you in the chat. So thank you for sharing. Now I'm going to turn it over. We're going to go into our Q&A period. We have a lot of questions for a lot of our different presenters on the call. So the first one is actually for Angelica, about if you could clarify the reasonable language that you added to that bill and what the original number for the rental fees was before it was changed to the reasonable language. We just wanted there's just some additional clarification requested in the Q&A.
Thanks, Tori, and thank you for the question. So Senator Robbie really worked really brought a lot of people into the table to make that change. I can't recall the number, but I know she worked very hard to change the language to make sure everybody was happy, and that reasonable language shift was kind of the shift that needed to get more support on it. And while Senate Bill 1039 doesn't provide a clear definition for that reasonable definition, it is a word that is used on a lot of Idaho codes when it comes to mortgage fees and, like I mentioned, storage facility fees. So a lot of the courts are already really familiar with what reasonableness means as a legal standard. So under Senate Bill 1039, when a tenant feels that believes that one of their fees that they're being charged is unreasonable, then they're able to take their landlord to small claims court to attempt to recoup those fees. So not a really defined definition, but just something that's used on Idaho code.
Great, thanks, Angelica, and hopefully that helped answer that question, Erin. Thanks for putting that in the chat. So we have a question about, I think for a couple of our folks, Katie, Andrew, about how did the landlords receive these laws, and did the rent go up? And actually, Angelica too, I would say, for this question. So how did the landlords receive these laws, and did the rent go up due to the increase in updating their units, or, not being able to use those charge those application fees or those additional fees anymore?
I can take a first stab at responding. So, the landlords, private landlords, did come out in opposition, and a lot of their arguments were that these bills would potentially increase their operating costs, and they would be difficult, or they wouldn't be able to properly screen tenants. Our counter to that, which, as I responded to another question in the chat, which is specific to the package of lead bills that passed, but a component of that, the reason these bills got introduced is because noncompliance was rampant. And so it is both looking at what resources exist to help, like if they're non-compliant, what are the tools to help them get into compliance so their units are lead safe. But also there are, unfortunately, there are some cases of repeat offenders, I'll say, and that ultimately resulted in a couple of lawsuits brought by the state against landlords. And so to avoid that happening, the state having to take action, that was a significant motivating factor for getting these bills introduced. So they're not actually being asked to do anything additional on that end other than what's already required in the law. In regards to the application fees, we did hear from landlords from multiple, I would say that have multiple different types of portfolios about the application fees. And a lot of them actually said, I charge $20 and this is what it covers. And that, those aren't the issue. It's landlords that were charging, upwards of $75, $100, $200, and folks not even being able to see the unit or knowing what those fees were going towards. I think two things. I think one, it's too early, that doesn't actually go into effect until January, to associate any potential rent increases to the legislation. And two, I think it would be really challenging to tie causality of rent increases to these bills. It's because there's so many different forces in the market that do affect rent rates. That's the word I was looking for.
And then for our bill, so it didn't take effect until earlier this month, so we haven't seen if it's affected rents. But I know that when bringing this legislation forward, Senator Robbie was in touch with landlords, and it was, for most of landlords, it was already best practice for fees to be reasonable. This solidified so that renters can come and claim and take landlords to small claim courts if they saw that the fees were unreasonable, but it seemed like it was already a best practice for landlords in our state.
Andrew, do you have anything to add in terms of how did the landlords receive these laws, especially as it connected to habitability and updating their units?
Well, I mean, the one bill law that passed that I mentioned that had our eviction filing ceiling, like frankly, it came from the industry itself. So it sailed through, and it had broad bipartisan support. And unfortunately, that hasn't made it any easier in the couple of years since to be able to pass stronger tenant protections. However, it's made more of those legislators aware of the issue, and we've got, we got to a place where a good bill was scheduled for a hearing, and a day or two before it was pulled, showing that there's a fight behind the scenes to make sure that didn't come to light and be able to share testimony on it. So we still got an uphill battle in front of us, But, we take those wins, we spread awareness, and we try to stack them as much as possible.
That's great. Thanks all. There's another question for all of you. So there's someone on our call who does constituent services, and they're a liaison for their office. So their question is, what is the best way to assist a constituent when it involves housing? Most of the time, when it involves Section 8 housing or the housing authority, the constituent is referred to their state member. I don't know if y'all have anything to share with that person.
Can you repeat the question again, Tori?
Sure. It was just about folks that call their constituent services liaison. What is the best way to assist them in terms of housing resources? So usually the person said they usually just refer them to their own member, their own representative. But I don't know if you all have any advice or recommendations for other ways to provide assistance. It's a little slightly unrelated to this topic, but thought I would put it out there because we have actually a lot of folks on the call today who have been posting about their eviction situations and their housing instability situations. So it seemed just relevant to what I've been seeing in the chat come through.
Gotcha. Well, what we've been trying to do in our project is bring the help closest to home as possible. So if you can work with community-based organizations and really have those trusted neighborhood messages. So we've been advocating for, yes, work with large nonprofits, but work with the Block clubs, work with the residents, and as we said, our community members, they do canvassing. We have a whole network of renters' rights groups and kind of more intimate settings where you could get help because people ask who they trust first. So being able to really develop those community partnerships is what's worked for us and what we're continuing to try and do. So shout out to my team members in the audience there. But that's what I would add.
I would just add that continuing to encourage impacted individuals to share their story with their state lawmakers. Kind of like our story, like one story can really make everything shift. So it's just super important that we're getting those stories out there and that our lawmakers are hearing from their constituents and impacted individuals in their state.
And I just echo that too. Frankly, if you're talking about state legislators, there's only a few that are really aware of these issues and that would have resources ready to be able to connect you with. So I would want to make sure, like if you were in Indiana, I would want to make sure that you went to Indiana Legal Services or Indiana legalhelp.org for those type of services, or some of the other resources that Prosperity Indiana has. But just like Angelica said, I would want to make sure that you're also sharing your story and sharing those concerns, at least letting those state and federal representatives know where the breakdown is, because frankly, it's up to them to put together the solutions, and partners like NLIHC have those recommendations.
That's great. Thanks all. Really appreciate your responses to that, and makes a lot of sense. So we have a question about, I think this is more for Katie and Andrew, but is there a bill, or do your bills that you pass around eviction ceiling have anything on there about how long an eviction can stay on the credit? This is a barrier for folks to get back into housing once they have that eviction on their record. I mean, I think that the ceiling or the expungement, prevents folks from looking at their record after a certain number of years, but I didn't know if, there's any aspects of your legislation that includes that credit report aspect.
Our bill does not address that for folks that, unless they go through the process of requesting the eviction to be sealed. We did have a fair, I didn't talk about this, but I'll just mention it. We also have a fair chance housing bill that would have limited background checks, criminal background checks and credit checks with a shorter look back period for, I think, limiting it to 3 years. We're going to continue to advocate for that bill. It's going to take, I think, a while, especially because the champion of that bill is our lieutenant governor, and she's currently running for 1st congressional district. So, you know, we'll see what happens with that, but that might also be a way to ameliorate a lot of the issues with tenant screening that ultimately result in people not accessing housing.
And I'll just add that, you know, our preferred legislation would have tackled some of that credit reporting and some of that third-party data. Unfortunately, we were not in control of what ended up passing. And that's been a tough conversation. There's some confusion about what is happening at the federal level. There's some legislators that think that, oh, we don't have to worry about that because it's going to be taken care of or has been taken care of at the federal level. So that continues to be work that we have to do in the future.
Great. And there's a question for Tanya about just who were your biggest allies in getting the actual right to counsel implementation passed? And actually, if you could talk about who your allies were in getting the implementation passed. So the legislation passed, and then also who are your allies in getting implementation fixed when there was those challenges with the courts?
Yeah. So our allies, I would kind of put them in 3 categories. I mean, certainly community members are number one. Community members really got out and got to city council meetings, sent those emails, made those phone calls, and really put the pressure on. And we wouldn't have got anywhere without people standing up and raising their voices. So community members first and foremost. Advocacy organizations really stepped up to the plate. We have in the Right to Counsel Coalition, there are kind of 21 stakeholder organizations, but we had, you know, some larger organizations like the ACLU kind of lend us their mobilization type software to be able to organize in a more sophisticated way. So our advocacy groups really got behind us, some of the local and state groups. And we had great legislative champions. So our city council president, you know, introduced it and stuck with it, you know, didn't just, you know, say, I did that and I'm done. So along with, I think I see one of our former state reps here, Cynthia Johnson, and we had some good champions. So it was a good combination. We had national support to kind of work through some of the finer points, so we were able to tap into the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel and make connections with other cities too, so we could kind of learn and pick up some strategies and tips for seeing what was going on across the country. So it was a combination. We decided we're going everywhere, we're asking everybody, but categorically, you know, those were the kind of largest categories of allies. And I think together we had a really strong network to make the press and get it passed. And recently, in terms of our court challenges, a similar approach, you know, community members coming out, calling, raising their voices, coming to meetings and having conversations with the court and really sharing stories, because the courts are different than legislative bodies. You know, they typically don't have public meetings. So being able to make those more intimate connections with court officials and community residents was pivotal, really. Again, our internal legislative champions at the city council level and state level all coming to the table and saying, hey, why don't we look at it this way, and just not giving up. So in a nutshell, I can't say one person or one group, you know, got us over the hump, but really a collection of many hands coming together.
Thank you, Tanya. And I don't know, Andrew, Angelica, or Katie, if you want to answer the question of allies, who are your strongest allies? I know, Andrew, you had mentioned that the apartment folks were not opposed to the legislation, but I don't know if you folks want to discuss that a little bit. I think, you know, that's an important question when we're thinking about how to be successful in these campaigns, who you can really bring into your work and your partnerships.
Yeah, I mean, I think I talked about our legislative allies, and certainly having political will it's a game changer in terms of advocacy, but also just working across the coalitions. And I think there are sometimes there's not always agreement in the strategy, but there's agreement on the common vision and what we want to accomplish together. And so being able to focus on that. And I would go back to, we did have a couple landlords that spoke in support of some of the bills. And I think that was helpful, having champions in state government as well, as I mentioned. So I think, those are some of our allies that definitely contributed to the success of these bills passing.
And I would just say, there's we could talk for a long time about coalition building and how important that is. But I think we found that it's important to have people who really know housing, because either they are low income residents themselves and have lived it, or they are, nonprofit organizations that provide it. And there's some allies that are, like AARP Indiana has been really strong at the State House, and they have a really broad network of members. And so if they help put out an action alert, that reaches a lot of people. And it is really important, especially in a state like Indiana, it has to be bipartisan from the start in order to have a chance to move. So making sure we're cultivating those relationships and finding support on both sides of the aisle. Yeah.
And then for Idaho, our success is really bringing in that multi-sector lens of housing impacts every aspect of our lives. So some of our strongest partners are some from like the Idaho Food Bank, who work with hunger relief, or AARP Idaho has also been a great help, and just bringing in that lens and showing lawmakers that this impacts everything when it comes, housing impacts everything, like your health, your access to medications, your access to your jobs and education. So bringing in that lens has been very helpful in our state.
That's great. Thanks all. Andrew, there's a question for you about, so you mentioned your version of the record ceiling bill was not the one that ultimately moved through the legislature and passed. Can you share a bit more about why conservative legislators were brought into this other bill, and where was the political pressure coming from for them to advance any reform at all?
Well, again, this is what I've said, that the other bill, the eviction filing ceiling, was frankly kind of an add-on. The main purpose of that bill, that was some industry members, was to make sure that the landlord tenant settlement conference program could never be mandatory, would always have to be voluntary. I think, my thought is that even some parts of that housing industry realize that the overwhelmingly large numbers of eviction filing numbers, frankly, made them look bad. And I think that in some ways, having that opportunity to put out a carrot of saying your eviction filing can be sealed if you pay up was a pro for them. So it's a pro in order to be able to have those filings sealed. And that's an example of sometimes those finding strange partnerships, finding common ground, even when, in this case, we weren't in control of the language, it created a net benefit in the end.
That's a great point. And thank you for that. So I want to thank all of our lovely presenters, Tanya, Katie, Angelica, and Andrew, for getting on today and really sharing the wonderful successes that you all experienced or helped accomplish around tenant protections. And thank you all who were able to join us today. Really appreciated your support and your wonderful questions. We are having one more webinar on August 24th at 3 p.m. on emergency rental assistance and what some of those permanent programs look like and what aspects of emergency rental assistance programs have incorporated and continued on. So I hope you can all join us for that. And thanks again for getting on today. Have a lovely rest of your Thursday, everybody. Thanks so much.